Hello, welcome to the Bearded Tits podcast, hosted by me, Jack Perks. Professionally, I'm a wildlife cameraman, but I dabble in podcasting, and each Tuesday we release an episode as I have a chat with scientists, artists, filmmakers, and passionate people all about nature in a light-hearted and certainly not serious way. Hello and welcome to the Bearded Tits podcast. I'm your host, Jack Perks. Now in this week's episode, I'm speaking to Colin Bean as we chat all about the European whitefish and some of its rarest relatives. If you've never heard of those fish before, it's because they're the rarest freshwater fish in Britain. So we're going to talk a little bit about how they got to the British Isles, where you find them, some of the names they go by, their lifestyle. Colin's an expert on these things, so it's fantastic to have him on. I met him years ago, long time ago, and he's a lovely bloke, so I'm really looking forward to that. Now, this is the final episode of this season, and I'm only going to be doing one more season, which will be coming out beginning of next year. The reason being, I've been doing this podcast for 5 years now. I started it during the pandemic, and I've enjoyed it. It's been phenomenal. But honestly, I feel like I've done everything that I can do. I've spoken to every person I can get on the pod. So if you're ever thinking, why has Jack never got that person on the podcast? I've probably asked that person, but they've not wanted to do it. So there's lots of people I wanted to get on, and they've not wanted to come on for various reasons. Although I've got lots of people I have wanted to come on as well. We've had some fantastic guests over the years, so it's been brilliant. So between now and the final season, I will be releasing the odd bonus episode. I've got one that I recorded in Australia about the platypus. That's coming out in June. I will be at Global Bird Fair this year from the 11th of July to the 13th, and I'm going to be doing a live episode there. So if you're planning to go to Global Bird Fair, if you keep an eye on the programme, I don't know exactly when I'll be on, but I will be doing a live podcast there. I'm also going to have a stall at Bird Fair. So if you want to come along, come say hello. We can have a little chat, have a little waffle. Ideally buy something, you know. I'm not there to look pretty. I want to sell some bits. But yeah, all joking aside, I would love to meet some people who listen to the podcast. And I will have a stall selling like my book. So if you want to get a signed copy of my book or posters and stuff like that, I'll be there. And I'm also going to have some aquariums with me with some aquatic species in there to kind of show bits of. While I'm mentioning the book as well, because I should definitely plug that. So if you want to get a copy of my latest book, A Field Guide to British Fish, freshwater and marine species covered in it, I am going to do a limited release of signed copies. I've got no idea if by the time this podcast comes out, if there'll even be any left. There's only 100 that I'm doing. So if you go onto my website, jackperksphotography.com, or the link in the description, you can go on there and you can buy some. After that, I'm not selling anymore because they cost quite a lot of money for me to buy, even at a discounted rate. So I will be selling them at Bird Fair as well, so you could pick them up there or you can buy them online. Anyway, I feel like that's enough self-promotion for one day. Let's get chatting to Colin and let's find out about European whitefish. Welcome to the podcast, Colin.
Thank you, Jack. Nice to be here.
Yeah, do you want to just say who you are and what you do before we get started?
Yeah, my name is Colin Adams. I'm Professor of Freshwater Ecology at the University of Glasgow, and I'm based at the University of Glasgow's field station, which is on East Loch Lomond side.
So I had the privilege of going there a few years ago. My hair was a little bit longer. My beard's got longer, but it seems like the hair on top's retreated, but the hair below's gone. And we met then briefly, didn't we? And it was very nice to actually see some juvenile power. And I think you had some char as well at the time. I don't know if you were experimenting on char, but there was some of there, so it was fantastic to do that. A lot of our listeners might not be familiar with what a whitefish is, so I'm going to let you just explain what they are.
Well, whitefish is a sort of a generic name for three species which are found in the UK. Three species of fairly closely related fish species, all of which are now lumped into the same family as salmon and trout, the Salmonidae. But previously had been in a single family on their own called Corrigonidae. So they've all got the same genus name. They're all Corrigonous something or other. And they're all rare species, including, well, in fact, they are the three rarest freshwater fish species in the United Kingdom and Ireland. So they're spread across the Ireland as well. Um, and the three species have various common names. Corriganus laveritis is the full scientific name for a thing that in Scotland we call Pollan. It's found in one place in Wales where it's called Gwyniad, and it's found in the Lake District in England as well, where it's known as Shelley. So that's probably the most widely distributed of these three rare species, because it has 7 populations across Wales, northern England, and Scotland. But even that's not very many, and that species has quite a lot of protection because of that. The rarer species of the three is a species which is commonly called Vendace, and Vendace now only has 2 native populations left in the United Kingdom. Both of those are in the Lake District. One is in Bassenthwaite and one is in Derwentwater in the Lake District. But up until the 1970s, there were 2 native populations in Scotland. Unfortunately, both of those have become extinct.
I didn't know that. I know you were working on that, so they're no longer present in Scotland now.
And they're as a native species, no. There
Right.
have been some conservation measures that have involved repatriating, if you would like to think about that word,
Yeah.
populations back into Scotland, but the original stock population is from the Lake District, the only 2 remaining wild populations, native wild populations.
Oh, what a shame that we've lost the Scottish strain then of Vendace. That's such a yeah.
Absolutely. They're lost but not forgotten. The 2 populations that were in Scotland were in 2 amazing sites, both in around the town of Lochmaben and Dumfries and Galloway, both very, very small sites, just lakes that are a few hectares in size. The last fish that had been seen by anyone that we know about, anyone that recorded it, came from Mill Loch in just next to Lochmaben, and it was seen by the great Peter Maitland, who was doing some conservation work there and was able to capture a specimen. And that last specimen was seen in 1975. I've got a photograph of it. I've never actually seen them, personally, because that was quite some time ago now. But they are most certainly not forgotten by the locals. There is a housing estate in Lochmaben which has got a number of indicators of those missing populations. So there's a famous road which has now been photographed by almost every fish biologist in the United Kingdom, which is called Vendace Drive. So although the species is gone, there's still Vendace Drive to remember them by.
It's funny how there are things like that because there's a road where I grew up in Nottingham called Sturgeon Avenue, and it's because I don't know how many years ago, but a very large sturgeon came out of the Trent not far from there. So it's funny how fish leave these historical markers, isn't it?
Well, historically, the town of Lochmaben was exceptionally proud of what they regarded as a totally unique species, which was only found in their patch. And of course, they were very protective of it and
Yeah, yeah.
celebrated it and so on. So it was known historically by everyone who lived round the area as being something that was very particular to that bit of Dumfriesshire as it was at the time,
Yeah.
and celebrated because of that. And in fact, there were 2 clubs based in Lochmaben, in and around Lochmaben. There was one called the Vendace Club, and there was another one called the Magdalen Vendace Club. And the Vendace Club was formed by a bunch of well-to-do aristocrats who every year celebrated their local fish by going out on a fishing expedition to capture enough for them to have lunch. And so they went out in boats. Probably their staff did most of the work, I suspect. And they captured they put out nets and they captured a few of the local Vendace and took them ashore. And and took them to a local hostel, and got a chef there to cook them up for their lunch, and they had a great old time, and then went away and did the same again next year. So it was a once a year event.
Because am I right in saying across the rest of Europe, where these species are a lot more common, they're quite a common food fish, aren't they?
They are.
Yeah.
So Vendace is, it's very heavily protected in the United Kingdom. But in fact, if you pop into a restaurant in Helsinki, you will find it on the menu without too much trouble.
Is that
Uh,
right? Wow.
yes,
Yeah.
it's and I'm not sure I'm allowed to say this in a podcast, but I have eaten Vendace,
No, no, I would be
albeit
ashamed if
not
you
in the
hadn't.
United Kingdom.
And go on, because everyone's going to wonder what did it taste like?
They taste good. They
Yeah.
taste good. They've got the same bone structure as trout and salmon, so they have these hanging bones which are in the musculature, which is a bit annoying when you're eating them.
Yeah.
But they're perfectly tasty. A little bit like trout in some ways.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
No, I went to Belgium a couple of years ago to film burbot, and I did eat a burbot while I was there, a farmed one, I should say, and
yeah.
yeah, that was very tasty as well. So yeah, there should be. It's almost like those. Is it like those Victorian societies that would eat rare animals? I don't think we're quite that bad, but yeah, it's along the same lines. And so we mentioned two of the species. So you mentioned there was three. What was the third one?
Well, the third one is found in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and it's called pollen. Um, it is all three species are actually look quite similar. They're not identical, but they look quite similar. And pollen Loch Ness is the big population. Again, they're quite rare, but strangely, there is a commercial fishery for pollen, and there has been, well, historically almost forever. And most of that commercial fishery is based in Loch Ness. But they're also found in about four other Irish lochs, in most, I think all of them, in fact, in the Republic of Ireland. Um, and so that comprises the three species. I should probably just give your listeners a hint of what they look like.
Yeah, go for it.
So they are very silvery fish, so they're covered in scales, large scales compared with salmon and trout, which people are probably more familiar with. So they have scale sizes which are closer to the scale size of a carp rather than a salmonid, but they do have the adipose fin that other salmon and trout family fish have. Um, they are they're quite deep bodied. Vendace slightly less so than Pollan and Pollan, and they're laterally flattened, so they're flattened from side to side rather than sort of top to bottom like flatfish are. They get to reasonable sizes, different species, different sizes, but Pollan and Pollan, a big one would be 35 centimeters, so that's about 14 inches, something like that. Vendace are quite a bit smaller, so and they tend to get to sort of maximum size very quickly. So they grow very quickly, get to a maximum size, and then sort of stay there
Yeah.
over multiple years. So a big one would be 20 centimeters, something like that. So markedly
Yeah.
smaller than the other two species.
A lot smaller, yeah, and because I often when I'm talking to other kind of fishy people, there can be confusion because it's got a different name in each country. So obviously, with the when we're just talking about Powins, obviously in Scotland you call it Powin, England we call them a Skelly, and Wales it's a Gwynniad. So is it largely agreed upon that it is the same species? Because I know sometimes depends who you ask. Some people say they're all separate. Others they say they're the same. So what's the science at the moment saying?
You don't know what kind of can of worms you've just opened. They are the conventional wisdom is that Corriganus lavaritus is the same species across Wales, England, Scotland.
Okay.
There has been in the past, during the Victorian era a tendency to split up species quite a lot.
Yeah.
And that's partly driven by the fact that each population, which is they're lake dwelling fish, so each population in each lake looks slightly different from another population, even neighbouring populations. So the two populations in Scotland, the native ones are in Loch Eck and Loch Lomond, and they're only 30 kilometres apart, so there's hardly any sort of geographic distance between them, but there's quite a marked difference in terms of what they look like. And if you had two in your hand, you would be able to point to the differences between the two. But when you tease them apart genetically and you try and look in more detail by collecting quantitative information on how different they are, they all group together. So they're a variable. It's a variable species, but effectively they're all one species. There is still a bit of argument over that, I've got to say, and the International Union for Conservation of Nature.
I saw that. Yes, I wondered if you'd mentioned that.
They do continue to separate them into multiple species. The sort of English, Welsh, and Scottish species they're still recording as separate. But yeah, hence the controversy that I mentioned.
Because I mean, I guess it's like brown trout come in so many different shapes and sizes, but they're all lumped together as salmo trutta, and I guess this is kind of similar. These are all the same species, but slightly morphologically different.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and you can detect some genetic differences because they've been isolated. The various populations have been isolated from each other more or less since the end of the last glaciation, so
Yeah.
12, 13,000 years. So they've accumulated
Yeah.
some differences from each other. And it's an age-old question, how much of this difference do two groups need to have before you call them species? To some extent, it doesn't matter.
No, I think you're
Fish don't
right.
care.
Well, no, precisely, and as well, I suppose if you want to be philosophical about it, species is a human term, isn't it? We're deeming, well, that's a species, that's not a species, until enough people agree that it's not a species, or enough people agree that it is a species. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. It's why I've started referring to them as European whitefish as opposed to Pollan, Gwynedd, because it depends whichever country you are. If you say the other one, they get a bit annoyed that you're not naming it. So I must admit I tend to say Pollan just because I've only seen them in Scotland, so I'm sort of switched on to that. But I've started saying European whitefish more and more. We touched upon that they're in these large lakes. So how did they get into these lakes?
They all have very close ancestors or um, uh, that are capable of swimming through salt water. So they're all capable of getting into salt water, migrating around the coast, and then migrating into fresh water. And in fact, pollen probably elsewhere where we've got the same species, pollen. Elsewhere, it's sometimes called the Arctic cisco. A lot of the population still migrate to sea every year.
Ah, okay.
They don't in Loch Ness. They don't. Well, there is some hint that perhaps some populations have, in the last few years, migrated into saltwater from populations in Southern Ireland, particularly in the Erne. But in general, the species elsewhere in its range in North America. So it's found in Alaska and northern Canada, and it's found in Siberia throughout the sort of northern part of Asia. Then they're, as we would call them, anadromous. They migrate off they breed in freshwater, but then migrate off to sea to feed as part of their life cycle. So we know this group has very, very close associations with saltwater, and we're fairly certain that they migrated into UK waters, and particularly the northern parts of UK waters, by migrating the areas that were glaciated during the last glaciation. As the glaciers retreated, then the fish were able to get in through the sea route into fresh water.
Do we have any evidence of how prevalent they were? Because I know we obviously class them as all very rare fish now, but would they have been fairly abundant in the lakes at one point? I mean, I guess a lot of invasive species. We can kind of come on to some of the threats in a bit, but yeah, I don't know how common they would have been previously.
This is a question that you find fish scientists talking about over coffee quite frequently, because the answer is we don't know.
Okay.
But the assumption has got to be that, well, firstly, let's begin with what we do know. Historically, we know there's been a relatively small number of populations in the United Kingdom and Ireland. So historically, we don't know of any more than those two populations that are in Scotland, and 4 in England and 1 in Wales for Corriganus laveritus, the thing that we're calling Pollan or Whitefish. But the trouble is, when you think about it in terms of how these fish got here, as we just have been doing, they migrated in through the sea route, they came into freshwater. They couldn't possibly have just migrated into the few freshwater bodies that we now know them to be alive and thriving in. They must have invaded lots of other sites as well, which means that they've probably, and this is the sort of most likely scenario, is that they've been lost from a large number of places prehistory, where they must have got access to, but for some reason have become extinct. But they became extinct, more than 2 or 3 centuries ago, which is kind of like our historical record goes back about 2 or 2.5 centuries.
Right.
So the presumption is they were there and they've now been lost, and the few places where they are now found are sort of remnants of what must have been a wider distribution.
I suppose when you think about it as well, because they're, and I don't want to offend any whitefish fans, they're quite a plain looking fish. So if you're trying to look back at records hundreds of years ago, a silvery fish in a river could be any number of fish, couldn't it? So those whitefish could have been mixing in rivers with all manner of coarse fish and just all kind of got lumped in together and then lost over time.
Could have been. I think the main issue really was not that they were overlooked necessarily, but in fact there was very little written down.
Right. Okay.
So when we go back 250 years, you're looking at some very, very early writings on the natural world. And prior to that time in the United Kingdom, people were just they didn't have an awful lot of time to spend writing down what they saw in the natural world. They just struggled to get through. So I think it's the writing rather than anything else that's probably missing.
Yeah.
From the story of what happened more than a couple of centuries ago.
No, that makes sense. So obviously they are quite rare. They've got a limited distribution. What kind of threats are they facing? Because obviously, like you say, these are the 3 rarest fish that we have in freshwater. So what's worrying a whitefish?
Well, the biggest worry is that these are specialists of cold, deep waters, which are highly oxygenated. And of course, with the encroachment of global warming, water temperatures are going up. And these guys are at the southern end of their current range on the planet. They're northerly species, basically. And so as waters start to warm, oxygen concentrations go down in water, and these fish are being squeezed because of that. They're potentially going to be squeezed because of that. So that's one of the main issues. But there's a bunch of others. They're non-native species coming in to somehow impact upon them. When you think about the likelihood that there was probably hundreds, possibly even thousands of populations historically, long before people were having major impacts on the environment, these fish were probably lost. The sort of post-glacial populations were probably lost because of natural factors like competition with other species, as other species managed to migrate into freshwaters. And so that kind of gives us a hint that invasive species are likely to impact upon our whitefish populations as well. And we have seen some of that. For example, Loch Lomond had, in the late 1980s, a new species appeared, the perch family species, Gymnocephalus cernius. And it's an innocuous small fish. Probably wouldn't have thought that it would cause much damage, but one of its real skills in life is that it is very good at surviving and continuing to eat at very low water temperatures. And it also likes to feed on eggs of other species. And so we know that in Loch Lomond, they've been eating Pollan eggs in abundance since they established a large population here, and that is a threat
Yeah.
to the breeding success of the population here.
What are the numbers like in Loch Lomond now? Because I know that obviously you've got ruff in there, you've got roach and all kinds of other fish that they wouldn't have previously had to kind of contend with. I'm guessing not high numbers anymore, or how are they doing?
Actually, they're doing really quite well,
Oh, are they? Oh,
surprisingly.
good. Okay, I wasn't expecting that. Fantastic.
They're doing really well. Um, they have threats, yes, absolutely, but and the population did start to decline a bit in the 1990s, and there was a lot of concern about that time because that was the time when rough numbers were particularly high. But they've bounced back again, and the population is reasonably healthy. I wouldn't, it's
Oh,
probably not as good as it could be, but it is pretty reasonably healthy. There's no immediate cause for concern about an extinction from Loch Lomond. And Loch Eck, the other population in Scotland, is equally doing reasonably well.
oh,
So
right.
it's a
Okay.
reasonably it's a goodish story about which is nice to hear every now and again.
Well, yeah, yes, you need to cut through the doom and gloom sometimes, don't you? I suppose the ones that survive, they're born into this competition, and I guess if they're not going to survive, pretty quickly. So I guess they're adapting, presumably.
Um, they're obviously changing as all wild populations change
Yeah.
over time as the pressures that they face change, then they evolve, and evolution hasn't stopped. We kind of think that evolution is the thing that shaped our biodiversity, back in the day. Well, it did, but it's still going on. It's not changing. The fact that those processes are still going on, that they're still shaping the populations that we see in front of us now.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. 'Cause I see the odd photo from people who go roach fishing on Loch Lomond, and occasionally they end up catching a pow, and you just think, okay, well, there must be a few knocking about if they're accidentally picking them up. Because one thing I should point out, if people are listening, you're not allowed to target them if you're angling. Like if you catch one by accident, then it's okay. But yeah, you're not actually allowed to target them. I believe that's the case in Scotland as well, isn't it? You can't target them in Scotland.
It absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
It's Wildlife and Countryside Act protected species under Schedule 5, which gives it the same protection as would bats and all sorts
Yeah.
of other things. So it's illegal to handle or
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
catch, keep, or handle.
So
Um,
if
yeah.
someone does get one by accident, just release it very quickly and yeah, just let it
Yep.
let it be on its way. But
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, because I did go to Red Tarn last year to try and film some, and I thought, oh, it's only going to be a short walk, and about about killed me getting up. If anyone's into their walking, it's Helvellyn, and it was about 2.5 hours to get up there, and then I realised that the lake that it's in, I say lake, it's not massive, but it's big enough. It just sort of drops and then went doof. So I didn't really get any footage, but I'd love to go again with some snorkel gear and actually get some cameras in there because I think that'd be just because it's a smaller lake. I'd hopefully have a bit more chance, but I don't know if there's been any recent studies on how they're doing up there. But I know they were historically there, weren't they?
They certainly were, and I don't know of what their current status is like, but I suspect that's because they haven't been monitored for a while.
Yeah, that's my thinking. I just think no one's looked. It's not that they've declined. It's a
No.
it's a bloody long walk, so people can't be doing with it. That's great. Do you know anything about? I was doing some research into whitefish. There's one called a houting, or there was one called a houting. Do you know anything about those?
Yeah, they're now they were in the UK, but there's some slight uncertainty about how many populations there were
Okay,
and whether they were potentially just what the bird people would call vagrants,
right.
because they do migrate to sea. And I think when we've had records of outing, these are fish that one argument is that they're fish that have strayed into UK waters from elsewhere. But there is some evidence that there were populations, but these populations that bred in the UK. But certainly they no longer do
No.
breed in the UK.
because I believe there's some still in Denmark. I think I might be wrong on
There
that.
are.
Um,
You're correct.
okay.
That's right. Yeah, there are still a few around.
But yeah, I was trying to look into like just information about them, and there's not a great, certainly not online anyway. There might be some in some papers or textbooks, but there didn't seem to be a lot of information. But yeah, they get a little bit bigger. I guess you'd expect an Andromenous fish to be a bit bigger anyway. But um,
Yeah, because they're feeding at sea,
yeah,
relatively much richer, grow quite a bit faster. So I mean, and that's why salmon and some trout migrate to sea is to get large quickly.
yeah.
So yeah, that's also true of outing, which
Okay.
get to pretty large size.
We've talked a little bit about a kind of assisted migration, shall we say, with these fishes. Are there any plans to do any more of that, or are they kind of staying put where they are? I guess it's a big undertaking to get enough of these fish and to move them and paperwork and whatnot to do it.
Yes, shouldn't underestimate the paperwork and the regulations around this, but in fact, there has been an enormous amount of effort in Scotland and in England trying to create refuge sites
Yeah,
where they might be a little bit more protected than they are their natural sites. So in Scotland, we've now got six conservation refuge sites, as we've been calling them. Um, and we know that all six of them, the populations have established. So they were created by mostly taking eggs. Going at spawning time to find adults, stripping eggs from those adults, fertilizing them very often in the field, rearing them up a little bit until they're either first feeding fry, in some cases releasing as eggs, and then taking them to the conservation refuge site and releasing them. And all six sites, we've been back to those six sites to find out if the population has become established, and they all have for Pollan, Corriganus laboritus, anyway.
oh,
I
fantastic.
mentioned I mentioned that there was some refuge sites for Vendace. Um, the they have also been doing reasonably well. So there are what is it? Three sites in Scotland where they've been new populations have been created, but using the English populations as donors, because of course we've lost all the Scottish populations. Um, and at least one of those is doing exceptionally well. There's one which we've never been back to yet. We haven't had the opportunity to go back to and see if there's an established population. And there's one where there's a population that's established, but it's at very, very small size. It hasn't become particularly large. So slightly more mixed results with Vendace.
I suppose the best way to compare it to is like I mean, people might be more familiar with white-clawed crayfish, which I know they're not native to Scotland, but certainly in England, people will be taking white-clawed crayfish from rivers and then putting them in remote ponds where they're less likely to compete with signal crayfish, and then just keeping those as a refuge. So it's a similar concept here, I guess, isn't it?
It's exactly the same
Okay,
concept. Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And that's good to hear about Vendays because as far as I know, the English ones we either don't know or they're not doing great. I know certainly Derwentwater they're not thriving. I don't know about Bass and Weight.
Well, I've got some fairly hot news about
Okay,
that because
okay.
we spent last September down in the Lake District. A PhD student of mine, Rudy Forrester, and I went down there and we did some work looking at the two native populations of Vendace with some work funded by English Nature and in fact the populations of both Bassenthwaite and Derwentwater are really pretty healthy. So they've been
Oh, good.
monitored not quite every year, but they've been monitored over about a period of about 15 or 16 years. And the numbers we were using sonar, a
Hmm.
combination of sonar with some capture techniques to try and work out what species were where. And the end result is the data is telling us that the population sizes in both sites are really as healthy as they've ever been in the last few years.
All right. Oh, fabulous.
Despite that, they have gone through a patch where populations have been quite low. They now seem to have bounced back. But uh, all of these things need to be taken with a little bit of a pinch of salt because whitefish populations in general, all three species, have this nasty habit of wobbling up and down very fast. So you get a good spawning season, and you get a very strong year class coming through. That seems to create an enormous population, but then a couple of years behind, you get very poor recruitment and very low populations. So the population size oscillates around all over the place.
Yes. Okay.
Try and pick up a sort of a signal of whether things are going in the right direction or the wrong direction takes quite a bit of work. You need to do quite a lot of monitoring to work out what the trend is.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Because some of the sites you've introduced and they're man-made. Is it? Am I right in saying in Scotland is there a couple of reservoirs that the whitefish are in?
They're actually all in
Oh, they're
reservoir.
all in. There you go. Okay.
And part of the reason for that is that, of course, when you're creating a new population, it's the equivalent of putting in potentially an invasive animal into a new site.
Yeah.
So you don't want to go into a pristine habitat and suddenly create a problem.
Yeah.
One of the ways of stepping around that potential issue, to create a conservation refuge site, is to use a site which is either human made or is in some way badly damaged for all sorts of other reasons, but is still capable of supporting the species that you want to create the conservation refuge for. So areas that are lakes that have been heavily dammed, or lakes which weren't lakes at all until they were dammed, kind of fit that criteria rather well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess with a reservoir, it should be relatively deep. The water quality needs to be fairly good because obviously we're drinking it. So I guess that ticks all the boxes, isn't it? That's a good one. If people want to find out more about whitefish, where would you kind of point them in the direction?
I would. There's a fair amount of stuff online, but I would point them towards um, a really good book, which is quite reasonably priced if you buy it in paperback. And it's one of the New Naturalist series. It's just very simply called Freshwater Fishes by Peter Maitland and Neil Campbell. You can find it online because I happened to look it up the other day to see how much it cost. It's I can't remember what year it was published in now. I'm just looking it up as we speak. Let me show it to the camera. I don't know
Yeah,
if
go for it. Yeah.
it's probably coming up back to front, but
No, I can see it. I can see it.
there we go.
Yeah.
Um, that is probably the most authoritative, comprehensive account of the freshwater fish species in the United Kingdom that exists. And it was written by Peter Maitland, who has spent decades and decades just gathering information and has an absolute wealth of knowledge on freshwater fish in the UK.
And I'm completely unbiased, but they're also mentioned in the book I've just released. So Peter probably knows a little bit more than me, but yeah, I have just written about them as well. Not to throw shade on that, but no, that's fantastic, fantastic. So yeah, thanks for coming on anyway, Colin. It's great to catch up and to find out a little bit more about these fish that I dare say most people have probably never heard of.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. All right, take care.
Thank you.
That was Colin Bean. He's a lovely bloke, knows his stuff about those fish. And there are fish that I wish more people would kind of learn a little bit about because there is a real concern that we might lose these fish if we don't do a little bit more for them. So it's great that Colin is championing them. I will just say my voice is going a little bit because I've got a bit of a cold. So if you think, God, Jack sounds a bit funny or a bit more funny than usual, it's because I've got a little bit of a sore throat. So I've not mentioned Buy Me a Coffee in this episode. If you listen regularly, you know the drill. If you want to support the podcast, go on to buymeacoffee.com. I'll read it out in an upcoming episode if you want to leave a message, all that usual stuff. If you can buy my book, that would be mostly appreciated. You can get them in Waterstones. You can order them in your local bookshop. It's with Bloomsbury, so it's a pretty big publisher, or you can get a signed copy from me directly. As I say, there will be a link in the description. So, for the final time this season, this has been the Bearded Tits podcast. I've been your host, Jack Perks, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Cheers.